Good. So let me go to the full screen here. Okay, so this is the new boss, not the same as the old boss, as we'll talk about. Um, so this is what I want to start with. Deng Xiaoping, the previous most important leader, although there were two other supreme leaders between Deng and Xi Jinping. Um, so there's my kind of headline, Deng is dead. Okay, so it's a joke, right? So we know that he's been dead since 1994, but the meaning of that is that um, he fundamentally changed China, right? He broke with the past of Mao Zedong's chaotic, um, I guess, innovating communism, which was even worse than Soviet communism or other forms of communism. And so he focused on what he called stability and development. Stability meant an end to the insane purges, constant purges, both within the party and the country as a whole, just anarchic experiments on the society, like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, all of which were so traumatizing to China. So, an end of all that and a refocus toward development that is away from this um, bizarre pursuit of personal glory by Mao Zedong, both within China and around the world, and to focus on a much narrower Chinese nationalist centric goal of developing China's potential, which had been so long held back in the modern era. And to do that, he focused on, as you all know, market reforms. And in order for those to achieve, in order for those to succeed, apart from the changes that he made internally, it required stable, good relations with the West, by which I mean the United States, its regional allies in Asia and Europe and other parts of what we call the Western world, although it's not just the West, of course, it's also the East and the center and so on. But um, the capitalist world, the democratic capitalist world, however you want to put that. So those policies were so successful, as you all know, that they became an orthodoxy in China. And the two subsequent leaders, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, they pursued Deng's policies largely unchanged. So one could say that Deng ruled from the grave for about 20 years after he actually passed away, in the sense that there were no fundamental changes. But under Xi Jinping, roughly in the last uh, 12 years or so, there has been a fundamental change in China. Now we're going to focus today on foreign policy, but we'll also briefly talk about the broader changes in domestic policy in China that have occurred as a result of Xi Jinping's leadership. So, especially over about the last 10 years, China has emerged from its you could say, quiet under Deng Xiaoping or inward focus under Deng Xiaoping to assertively challenge the United States in the region and in the world for global leadership. I'm not going to focus too much on theory here because I think that it's more important to talk about the facts and get everyone's reaction to the facts. But I am going to take a certain approach to trying to understand why Xi Jinping made these changes. And what I'm going to be focusing on are what I'm calling leadership preferences, meaning the goals and the priorities among those goals of Xi Jinping and the ways that those differ from his Deng era successors. The Deng era being the era when Deng ruled and the two supreme leaders that came after him. And apart from the specific goals and priorities outlined by Xi, one can also identify what I'm calling here habitually preferred methods. You can think of that as a leadership style that is a consistent way of making decisions, which is repeated over and over again across all the major areas where Xi Jinping has initiated statements. So we're going to look at his statements. What does he say his goals and priorities are, and how does he actually rule in the area of domestic policy? And then I think that we will see that there's a pretty good match with the pattern of foreign policy changes that he's undertaken in China. Okay, so let's just start out by briefly talking about some elements of his official philosophy. So it's called a Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. Not very beautiful, not a very beautiful title, but just to give you some idea of what this means, socialism with Chinese characteristics is an old concept of Mao Zedong's and kept by subsequent leaders. And basically, it means that China is under the Communist Party, under the Chinese Communist Party, is pursuing socialism, but that socialism is going to be importantly adjusted or modified to match the unique characteristics of China. And all the three major leaders, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping, who initiated new departures for China under Communist Party rule, have used this concept in order to justify their innovations. So Xi Jinping calls his own approach socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Okay, new era means we are no longer living in the Deng Xiaoping era. Okay, so that is very important, right? In other words, Xi Jinping is saying openly that he is making a break with the Deng Xiaoping era, despite the fact that it was, as I mentioned, such a success, and it had been established prior to him as a kind of orthodoxy for the Chinese Communist Party. He views his thought and his leadership of the party and of China as a whole as both necessary and sufficient for China's success in the world. And his distinctive goal is what he calls national rejuvenation. That's the process by which China assumes over time, a dominant position in the world. And that has great historical resonance, that idea for China, because China's conception of itself historically is that it is at the center of the world. And of course, that's what the name of China means. It means middle state or middle kingdom, something like that. Okay, this goal is going to be achieved by rebalancing the priorities of previous leaders. So Deng's approaches are going to be reduced or constrained or modified, among other things, by reasserting or reviving various Maoist goals and traditions. Among those are that the Communist Party has to return to its ideological roots and reassert a more general ideological and institutional control, both within the party and by the party over Chinese society. So here, Xi is basically saying that the laxity and pluralism which had developed within the Communist Party and within China during the Deng period has to be ended by going back to this more centralized system of ideological and institutional control. When it comes to the economy, the emphasis on economic growth has to be modified or downplayed or constrained. And in a number of ways, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, must continue to play a principal part, the principal part, that's actually a quote from one of Xi's important speeches at the Party Congress in 2017 and in other speeches. The party state must retain overall control of the economy. There can't be this decentralized development of the Chinese economy in the way that market economies tend to develop outside the control of the state. And other priorities outside of growth must receive more emphasis and importance, not just the issue of inequality, but also various modes of ideological and political control by the party. Okay, foreign policy, coming to our area of focus. So the quotes there are from Deng's famous description of what foreign policy is like under his leadership. Leaders should display calm. They should hide China's capacity. They should bide their time. They should not claim leadership in the world. In contrast to that, Xi talks about China moving closer to center stage in the world through all dimensions of national power, military power, economic power, cultural influence. This goes beyond the Maoist idea of China standing up and becoming fully independent against foreign influence, foreign aggression. It returns to the Maoist idea that Chinese socialism is a model for the rest of the world, will be a model for the future of the rest of the world. And the primary goal of this foreign policy, as well as of domestic policy, is this process of national rejuvenation that we talked about. And Xi is explicit about the fact that this is not only his goal, but it is the ultimate goal and climax of Communist Party rule in China. Okay, we don't have time to talk about domestic politics and policy, but I'm just briefly going to summarize some of the most important changes under Xi compared to Deng. A dramatic and almost constant wave of purges within the party and the various elements of what's called the party state, the various things that are controlled by the party, the state-owned enterprises, all kinds of important institutions in Chinese society. And this is selective in the sense that it's political. It focuses especially on rivals of Xi Jinping for power. And this is a break from previous Deng era leaders who allowed much more pluralism within the party. Xi insists upon one-man leadership. This is the term they use in China, the chairman of everything. No other Chinese supreme leader has ever tried to micromanage policy across all important areas like Xi Jinping wants to do. He changed fundamentally Deng's norms of what the Chinese Communist Party should be in the Deng era. So most importantly, eliminating the term limits. The two previous supreme leaders served only two 5-year terms. And Deng intended supreme leaders to serve only 10 years and then turn over power. So Xi Jinping changed that, as you all know, and assumed power indefinitely. He revived the Mao-style cult of personality, the constant praise of the supreme leader, which Deng so frowned upon. Repression of civil liberties and minorities, you're all aware of that. I think we don't need to talk about that. And in domestic economic policies, we've already talked about some of these points. De-emphasis on growth, more of an emphasis on state control, and a very important push to strengthen state-owned enterprises and pursue far-reaching industrial policies, especially in advanced technology industries, and to maintain and reinforce financial control. So for those of you that don't know this, the financial system in China has remained dominated by the big state-owned banks and other state-owned or state-controlled financial entities. So all major finance in the Chinese economy, even though it's a market economy, is controlled by the state. Okay, so if we look at Xi's statements, his ideological statements, and his domestic policies, that is independently of what we would infer from looking at foreign policies, we can see some of these elements. So impatient ambition is one. Okay, so Xi wants to be the instrument of China moving during this new era to a new place in terms of its internal development, internal characteristics, and its place in the world. And this is going to place him in the pantheon of Communist Party leaders alongside Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. He shows very strong confidence. So his leadership is the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. His leadership is the destiny of China. And this goes beyond merely other motives that sometimes are emphasized, such as diversionary nationalism, meaning wrap the leadership, the Chinese Communist Party wrapping itself in the Chinese flag, to cultivate support through the support of Chinese people for Chinese nationalist goals, as well as more genuine nationalism. It goes beyond those things to this tremendous confidence in himself as the instrument of China's final rise to its natural central place in the world. We already talked about micromanagement, the desire to personally control everything, the revival of the cult of personality, authoritarianism. Okay, so his default approach to solving policy problems is top-down control and repression of other points of view or approaches. And this is in contrast to other Deng era leaders that more often resorted to decentralized mechanisms, not only the market, but also greater pluralism in society, greater pluralism within the Communist Party itself at all of its levels, the central level, as well as the provincial and local levels. He isn't as focused on addressing underlying problems or on compromising, and very sensitive to any kind of criticism or disagreement. So let's finally come to a foreign policy now, which is our focus. So what I mainly want to do is just outline foreign policy under Xi Jinping and talk about how this is different from his Deng era predecessors. So the first area we'll talk about is military development. So what I mean by that is not just defense spending, but the types of defense spending and the types of military forces which are being fielded under Xi's rule. So I should say that prior to Xi Jinping, there was a long period since the Tiananmen revolt and massacre. There's been a long period of rapid military spending growth, which is roughly proportionate to the overall economic growth in China. But what is different under Xi Jinping is, number one, there's a huge effort to modernize and expand and qualitatively upgrade China's nuclear forces. So prior to Xi Jinping, China only maintained, I mean, we don't know the true number, but we think roughly a few hundred nuclear warheads. And these were, mostly, traditional silo-based weapons, which were only capable of launching a second strike against a potential nuclear attack by other nuclear powers, such as the United States or the Soviet Union, later Russia. But now China is building a complete nuclear force on the American or Russian models with all of their capabilities, as well as the size. So we're moving to a force now which is going to have thousands of warheads, and which is going to have all the major delivery systems by land, sea, and air, and which is also developing all kinds of modern technological characteristics that may give China first strike capabilities or the ability to threaten to use nuclear weapons in order to deter potential enemies from intervening in areas of Chinese concern. That's what the term escalation dominance refers to. More broadly, the Chinese military is changing its focus from homeland defense and a kind of emphasis on being a land power on the Asian landmass to a more American-style model of power projection and offensive capabilities to supplement its traditional defensive capabilities. So China is rapidly building, what they call a blue water navy, which can project force around the world. It's building all kinds of advanced strike and fighting capabilities on the American model, and is seeking not just to match the United States, but to leapfrog the United States in any area where it's capable of doing so. Okay, let's talk about territorial disputes now. This is very important, of course. Um, Actual kinetic conflict, war is most likely to break out in areas where there are important territorial disputes. So Xi Jinping's policies in these areas have been much more confrontational than previous leaders, and these confrontational policies started early on in Xi Jinping's term, and they run all along the periphery of China's territorial disputes, from the island dispute with Japan over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, down through the area around Taiwan, down to the South China Sea, and around to the long border with India. Um, and there have been important escalations in those more confrontational policies, both toward Taiwan and the Indian border since 2020, and most recently, especially toward the Philippines. Again, that's not new, but there's been an escalation there. So this is the third point there is there's no obvious grand strategic logic here, right? That is, it's kind of basic strategy that you don't want to fight all your potential enemies at once. You want to defeat them in some kind of order that makes calculated sense. But Xi has not done that. Instead, he is ratcheting up tensions and building the ability to win military confrontations against all of the major states that have territorial disputes with him. And because this is unsound strategy, it has had very damaging results for China's national interests. So predictably, all of these states have banded together and started to cooperate in a way which has been damaging to China's ability to achieve its goals. Okay, so I'll just give you one example of that. I mean, so Japan has announced that it's going to double its defense spending. And Japanese leaders are openly talk now about participating in a war to defend Taiwan with the United States. So this is completely unprecedented in the post-war history of Japan, and it's a major blunder or setback for China, in the sense that it was not necessary to provoke a response like this. And there are similar responses from Taiwan, from South Korea, from Australia, and from India. And all of these powers have close relations with the United States, and they're all starting to cooperate more and more with each other, and they all view China as the primary threat that they face in common. Okay, international economic policies. This is also very important, as we'll see. Okay, so under Xi Jinping, China has announced a series of major industrial policy initiatives, that is, state-led initiatives to develop the economy. The most famous one was called Made in China 2025. They changed the name because it was very scary to China's various economic partners, but they're continuing to pursue this policy. So basically, the goal is that China is not learning and integrating with the international economy anymore as it did in the Deng Xiaoping era. It now feels confident enough to pursue dominance in all major high technology areas. And the way in which it explicitly intends to achieve that is to first achieve that dominant within the home market by protecting it from foreign competition and subsidizing those industries. And then as the home market is conquered, there will be movement of those industries out into foreign markets to eventually pursue dominant positions in those markets also. In DFI, direct foreign investment, the role that this plays is not a kind of permanent part of the integration of China with the rest of the world, but it just represents foreign capital and know-how, which is going to be absorbed, copied, and then replaced by Chinese companies. Financial control. So Xi Jinping stopped the movement of previous leaders toward opening up the capital account, that is allowing freer capital flows, both inward and outward, between China and the rest of the world. And he imposed much greater controls on overseas investment by Chinese, limiting it to areas of priority technologies. Most of you know about China's foreign economic diplomacy. So there are both carrots and sticks here. One Belt, One Road is the policy of infrastructure development in exchange for political influence and market access, which China is pursuing around the world. And then there are also these draconian economic sanctions that Xi imposes on any government which defies him politically, economically, in any other way. So both of these policies are very different, again, from previous Chinese leaders. IP, intellectual property, no end to the systematic theft of foreign intellectual property, despite promises made to Obama and Trump. I should say that this is not limited to the United States. This is harming all companies using advanced technology. Just to give you an idea of the scale of this, it's estimated that this is worth $400 to $600 billion a year lost just to the United States. There are probably similar losses in proportion to economic size, for example, to Japan, South Korea, the European Union, the UK, and so on. So this represents an unprecedented theft of economic value in the world, in the modern world. Okay, what are the implications of these international economic policies? China is not integrating into the international economy in a decentralized market-based way in the way that other rising East Asian economies have done in the past, such as Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. In other words, it's not just largely letting its areas of specialization being determined by competition. Rather, it is pursuing this goal of dominance across all major high technology industries. And I should say that they're very explicit about this. So in Xi's speeches and in the summaries published after meetings of the Communist Party and the state in China, they give long lists of industries in which they're pursuing this goal, and it includes all major high technology industries. So given the scale of the Chinese economy and its successful modernization, it really means that this makes it impossible for there to be ordinary market competition and coexistence with China in a way that currently exists, for example, between the United States and other major economies in the world, such as Japan, South Korea, the European Union, the UK, and so on, right? It means that if you allow something like that to develop, China will simply use it to achieve this dominance. So you can think of some examples, like if you think about the area of telecommunications infrastructure, that's a famous area where the Chinese company Huawei has achieved a market leadership. So obviously, you cannot allow Huawei to set up your telecommunications infrastructure because it would mean that the Chinese state would control your telecommunications infrastructure. And we all know how central that is to every dimension of the market economy. Another example, which is currently receiving a lot of attention, is semiconductors. So China wants to dominate semiconductor production, including advanced semiconductors, through a massive program of state subsidies and provision of the protected home market. And if China were to attain such dominance in the way that it has, for example, in telecommunications, that would again be a threat to the economic position of all major economies. And the next point I want to make is that this inability to integrate with China is what we often call in the social sciences overdetermined. That is, it's impossible, or I shouldn't say impossible, it's virtually impossible or difficult to achieve for a variety of reasons, not just because China is not competing fairly in economic terms, but for two other important reasons. One is that the party state under Xi insists upon direct party state oversight and control over critical infrastructure and sensitive industries, such as telecommunications, such as major internet platforms. And that means that if those companies were operating on a large scale outside of China, that information control and that control over critical infrastructure would be transferred to the Chinese Communist Party. So obviously, most states cannot allow that, or most states, at least that are potentially in conflict with China, cannot allow that. Finally, China is now directly ratcheting up confrontation in a way which increases the probability of war. And many of these industries have military applications. And again, China cannot be allowed to achieve leadership in those industries. China's potential enemies cannot allow themselves to fall behind China in important areas. So for all of these reasons, the way China is running its economy for economic gain, or I should say economic dominance, the way China is running its economy for control of information and critical infrastructure, and the way China is running its economy for its military buildup, for all of these reasons, it is dangerous to integrate economically with China in an uncontrolled way. And the result of this is the second point there, the predictable outcome of these Chinese policies is that other major economies are going to separate their critical infrastructures and their strategic supply chains from China. This is the last area we'll talk about briefly in foreign policy. So most of you know the term wolf warrior diplomacy. So this means engaging in diplomatic statements, campaigns, events which are overtly confrontational, publicly confrontational. And obviously, this really undermines diplomacy to the extent that diplomacy is intended to reassure other countries, compromise with them, make deals with them. The second point there is that Xi has violated all major agreements that China has taken part in or agreed to, not just the World Trade Organization agreements, but building artificial islands in the South China Sea, for example, and then militarizing them despite its agreements with the United States not to. I should mention that some of those artificial islands are built on reefs on the high seas, meaning they're essentially islands built in the middle of the ocean where no state has any sovereign rights. Of course, the ending of Hong Kong's freedoms, contrary to the agreement with Britain, and the Phase One trade agreement is another example in the first Trump term to at least freeze the trade war, which was happening at that time. Okay, so this is the last slide, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So if we look at both domestic and foreign policy evidence, what do we see as a pattern for Xi Jinping? He insistently pushes forward to achieve his goals, and he does not back down or compromise, even when he meets resistance, whether that's domestically or abroad. He continues to try to push forward. On the other hand, we can see in the area of foreign policy, in an area where he faces more opposition than he does in domestic policy, that he can be deterred from, for example, attacking Taiwan or starting major wars over other territorial conflicts because there may be high costs and downside risks for China. So he's not reckless, at least to a point that would make war difficult to avoid. But the last point there is that this deterrence is going to be hard to maintain for a variety of reasons. First of all, China's relative power will probably continue to increase. That is, China's economic and military power relative to any one country or any group of countries. That's not certain, but it seems likely for the foreseeable future. The ability to deter China depends upon multiple foreign leaders, not just American leaders, being willing to sustain a will to resist and deter China. For example, in order to protect Taiwan, just to give you one example, the United States cannot do that without Japan. Okay, so that requires, at a minimum, Taiwanese, Japanese, and American leaders to coordinate in order to deter China, at least for the time being. Xi is very aggressive about using China's resources to seek advantage wherever he can in economic and military areas. He will predictably continue to do that wherever he can. He's not afraid to break things. Okay, if you look at, for example, the destruction of Taiwan's freedoms, there was no reason to do that. That occurred because of his insistence on pushing through policies that created a backlash in Hong Kong, and he did not draw back like previous Chinese leaders did. So he's not afraid of confrontation if he's convinced that he can succeed. So for all of these reasons, it's not going to be easy to deter Xi Jinping on an ongoing basis. I don't want to overemphasize the last point that I make now, but I'm just going to make this as a kind of standard qualification. There is some rumor, there are rumors, there is some buzz that there is a backlash occurring against Xi Jinping now within the Chinese Communist Party and within the People's Liberation Army, but we have no proof of that yet. So it's an opaque system like the old Soviet system was. So even though it looks like Xi Jinping is firmly in control, and as long as he is in control, we will have what we have now that we've been talking about. It's not true necessarily that he will be in power for the rest of his life. So I'll just stop there and open it up for questions.
Okay, great. There is a question in the Google Sheet, but we have Joseph Fleeman asked, what is the policy of China for the Middle East? And then I'll invite Alexander after you answer that question. Thank you, Shale.
Okay, yeah. So before talking about China's policy for the Middle East, I'll just say that China's policy anywhere is no longer an ideological policy, which is often disconnected from China's national interests as its leaders see it. Okay, so it's no longer ideological in the sense that it was under Mao Zedong. That was true under the Deng era leaders, and it continues to be true under Xi Jinping. So that means that China has an instrumental attitude toward foreign policy in any region. That is, it will just look at the opportunities in the region, and it will just pursue the policies that best enable the given Chinese leaders to achieve the goals as he sees them at that point in time. So in the Middle East, so China has multiple goals in the Middle East. It wants, of course, to retain secure access to Middle Eastern oil and gas, especially oil, on which it has become highly dependent. So China is dependent on Middle East energy roughly in the way that the United States was in the days of the pre-fracking revolution, before the days of the fracking revolution. So that's very important. China also wants maximum influence in the Middle East. It wants to influence as many countries as it can to support Chinese foreign policy goals, whatever those are. And then a third goal, I would say, is to divert the strength and attention of the United States away from areas of greater Chinese concern on its immediate periphery in East and South Asia. So you can think about the analogy of North Korea. So by supporting North Korea, China diverts resources and attention away from coping with China. And for similar reasons, China supports Russia in its war with Ukraine, Iran in its war with Israel. Like Russia, Iran would be far weaker and more backward economically and militarily without revenue from oil sales to China and without Chinese technology. So I'll stop there, and there may be more detailed questions later.
Thank you. Alexander, you're next.
First of all, thank you very much, Shale, for a very interesting talk. And I learned quite a bit about Xi Jinping's policies. I guess what I want to ask you is, it seems to me we're in a global situation which may be becoming the early stages of a kind of new Cold War between the United States and China, but with a big difference, namely that China is a peer economy of the United States. In fact, the British accounting firm PwC predicted that by 2050, China will have an economy at about 20% of the world's global GDP, while the United States would fall to 12. Obviously, we don't know, but it seems to be that there are unique challenges in addressing a nation which is not only a military power with a major nuclear military power, but also what has been, for decades, one of the fastest growing economy in the world, and one which could potentially surpass the United States. So, well, maybe in terms of the question, one of the big debates in American foreign policy is this pivot to Asia, and how far should it go, right? So if you think, like Elbridge Colby, for example, who's in the Trump administration, that China is going to be an overwhelming threat, and it will be very difficult for the United States to even prevent China from dominating Asia and driving the United States out, then the argument is the United States should put all its eggs in the East Asian basket and sort of leave Europe and the Middle East more to regional actors. But at the same time, there are others who are less, who think that the United States can still walk and chew gum, in effect, right? Continue to remain very actively engaged in Europe and the Middle East and contain China. So I was just curious what your position, what your thinking is on that question of can the United States contain China and continue to be a dominant player in these other spheres that have dominated so much of U.S. foreign policy? So that's my basic question.
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. Those are very important points. Okay, so before answering the question of how to optimize U.S. foreign policy, just to reiterate your points. So yeah, China is a peer economy. Okay, so the preferred measure of economists to measure the size of an economy is not exchange rates. It is not exchange rate measures. The exchange rate measure would just be, you just take the current exchange rates between currency, you exchange, Chinese yuan into dollars, and then you compare the size of the two economies. So using that measure, the US economy is still larger, but the preferred measure of the economists is what they call purchasing power parity, which means you just look at what basket of goods the average person can purchase in a place like the United States, and you ask, what is the ability of Chinese people to pursue that basket of goods? So if we use that measure, China's economy has been larger than the US economy already for a number of years. Now, I don't want to push that too far because China's economy is slowing down very rapidly for natural reasons, because it's getting wealthier, but perhaps even more importantly, because Xi Jinping is mismanaging the economy. So it's not clear that we can just project growth rates forward, especially if we're talking about not just the United States, but a coalition of states, which are scared by China's rise and behavior, especially. But getting back to the issue, the problem of dealing with, like you said, this is an economic, not a peer, that's not precise enough, but it's a what you could call a peer competitor. That's the term that the military strategists use. So it may be inferior or superior depending upon the area. But just to give you one example of an important area, so one of the legendary things about, the US economy was, once it enters a war, its ability to sort of outproduce any other economy by a significant margin. Well, we are not in that world anymore. I mean, if we were to get into a long-term kinetic war with China, and we were in a position of having to compete with China to build, in a quantitative sense, various kind of military platforms, we would be in deep trouble. Even with all of our allies, it would not be easy. Even assuming that the Japanese, the Indians, the Europeans, and so on started producing and helping to supply us on a large scale. So we can't get into a war with China like that. We don't want to get into a war like that with China. So like the old war that we planned to fight on the Central Front in Europe against the Soviet Union, we could not prevail for economic reasons if such a war went on for a long time against China. So we have to emphasize qualitative advantages and better training, war planning, and so on for contingencies in which we would fight China. Now, finally, to come around to your question about how to optimize US forces, I think there's some kind of Aristotelian mean here in adapting to this challenge. So there's no question that in terms of what military planners call mass, that is, where do we allocate the overwhelming proportion of US striking power, and how do we choose qualitatively what sort of striking power to develop? That has to be increasingly focused on dealing with a potential conflict against China. And you mentioned Albert Kolbe. So he famously, and I think correctly, argued that the center of gravity is a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That's the key potential conflict. That's where a war is likely to occur. And we have to prepare to win that war. And if we can do that, then we will be able to deter China. So now that doesn't mean that we should abandon other regions, because we can maintain an important presence, a valuable presence in other regions, which will benefit us in the event of a conflict with China. Okay, so in a potential conflict with China, we want to have close relations with Europe. I don't think that Europe is going to send us, like Stalin would have said, how many divisions is Europe going to send? But number one, they cannot send things that China needs for its economy and military. And number two, they can help to supply us with things that we need. Okay, so just to give you an example, there's a defense spending buildup supposedly happening now in Europe. They're going from 2% to 3.5% of GDP. They're going to be building a much stronger indigenous military production capability. Well, in an emergency, that can be used. It's not just a one-way street. I mean, right now we think about the United States, sending extra capacity to defend Europe in the event of an escalation of the conflict with Russia. Well, arms supplies can flow in the other direction too, or ammunition supplies can flow in the other direction too. Another example, if we look at the Middle East, would be China needs the energy of the Middle East, for example. So that is a potential weapon that can be used against China in the event of a conflict. So if the United States retains the ability to interdict energy supplies in the Middle East, that gives the United States a strong position. I'll just mention, coming back to Israel, because this is of interest to many people here. People often talk about the fact that the United States gives a lot of aid to Israel. Nowadays, it's mostly military aid. But from a military and strategic point of view, we've just seen a very good demonstration of this in the war with Iran. Israel right now is a kind of unassailable military citadel in the Middle East, which is allied with the United States. and which the United States would be able to use in various ways to defend its position in the region and to engage in offensive activity in the region. And there is no conceivable way for similar amounts of money that the United States could maintain that kind of military leverage in the region. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shale. We have some questions in the Google Sheet. So let's go to the second question first, because the first question's on AI. Can you comment on how the relative birth rates might affect all this? Will the rapidly aging population undermine the capacity of their economy to obtain the dominance that seems key to plans for overall dominance?
So I would say that this is more of a long-term threat to China. There's no question that it is a long-term threat. So according to most estimates right now, especially if you look at probably the more accurate informal estimates of China's birth rate, it's something like quote unquote 2/3 of a child per woman. Okay, so that is 1/3 roughly the birth rate in India, which is China's future peer competitor. So, if we project those birth rates forward, each generation, that difference has its impact. In the long run, India's, for example, economic and military potential is far greater than China's if India continues to develop economically, which it's likely to do. But this trend is too slow moving to affect the military balance significantly over the next, I guess you could say, generation, 20, 30 years. China's population, its working age population is already declining, but it's not declining that rapidly. Meantime, its productivity is going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to upgrade, technologically speaking. So, yeah, the low birth rate in China is not going to it's not going to deter China in the next 20 to 30 years.
Thank you. So back to the Google Sheet. Ask, are you familiar with China's stance on artificial intelligence development? Do we know if they share the same drive that the California tech companies have to be the first to develop a super AI? No doubt such a development will help with their surveillance.
That's a very important question. I'll just start out by saying, I don't have any more expertise in this area, particular area of AI than most people. I'll just say what's predictable based upon the nature of economic policy making under Xi Jinping, and that is that there's no question that they see AI as one of the most important technological frontiers, and they are going to be pouring huge resources into it. Is this going to give them an advantage? Because there's also no question that they're going to be much less efficient in doing that than Silicon Valley and other areas of American economic innovation are going to be, or AI innovation in other parts of the world, let's say. But they're certainly going to try to do it. Okay, so just to give you one example, AI has many potential applications in warfighting, of course, we all know that. And I mean, technological leapfrogging is everything in warfare, right? I mean, that's how many of the major surprises in military history have occurred. So we have to be very concerned about this and very afraid of what they might be able to do with AI. I'll just stop there because I don't have more specific expertise about it.
Okay, thank you. There are more questions in the sheet, and people can raise their hand as well. So thank you for a very helpful overview. I was wondering if you would be willing to comment on the extent to which, or the quality of any difficulties that you might face in discussing these issues within academia. Are there aspects of the China-world relations that dominant academic truisms make difficult or impossible to discuss openly?
Okay, yeah. So that's a good question. I think that there were two major barriers to discussing the threat from China um, more openly. And just to jump right to the answer, and then I'll go back and explain, I think Xi Jinping shattered both of those barriers. So one of the barriers was what you might call like what we call normal science, right? That is that dominant ways of understanding various kind of outcomes in the world tend to take hold in different disciplines. And this was true in the area of China study too. And I think that there was a kind of conventional wisdom in the Deng era that China's foreign and domestic policies were not going to change fundamentally, that they were basically set in stone, that Deng's influence and his successes were so dominant within the party that there could not be a fundamental changes because they would be blocked by various sources of leadership and power within the party. So that was one barrier. So for a long time, those that argued that China was turning into a threat, especially before Xi Jinping came to power, there was a kind of dismissal of that point of view. Oh, that's ridiculous. This is a new China we're dealing with. They're not interested in war. They're not interested in confrontation. I think that viewpoint was gradually discredited once Xi Jinping came to power by all of the kinds of actions that I've been talking about under Xi Jinping. Um, I think another barrier to discussion of China that was more open and honest was what you might call the Nixon-Kissinger consensus in foreign policy, which was that the way to deal with China was to engage with it, to facilitate China's peaceful rise, to be open to China's peaceful rise. And this would gradually lead to China becoming a status quo stakeholder in the international order, in which there would not need to be any significant confrontations. And again, I think that that viewpoint, which was dominant at the time that Xi Jinping assumed power in 2012, I think you could almost say not only is it in retreat now, it's dead. So if you look at debates over foreign policy, over military planning, not just in the United States, but throughout the region, in Japan, in Taiwan, in India, in South Korea, I mean, there's no debate about the fact that we're dealing with a new China. There is a debate about what we should do about it. But there is definitely an open, freewheeling debate about how threatening China is and what we need to do about it.
Thank you. Gabriel has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Shale, for this fantastic talk. Just following up on what you're saying now, I mean, is there a way? I mean, it seems to me our policy is to try to take as much economic advantage of China as possible. I mean, we want their cheap stuff, and we want to be able to do that without having too much, loss of our own power and dominance. Is that possible?
Yeah, so a good question. Now, the one of the elements of the old foreign policy consensus, which not just American, but I would say all the major market economies bought into this logic was that, by that I mean, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, European Union economies, the UK, Australia, and so on, was that, the Chinese market was going to be the most important market in the world, and they wanted access to that market. So they didn't want to just import cheap goods from China. They also wanted to sell their products in China. And that was viewed as even more important by foreign business because of how promising that market was felt to be. Now, those calculations have changed for the reasons that we talked about. When it comes to low-end products, China no longer has a significant comparative advantage over economies like Vietnam or India. Those economies are not yet at the level of China's in terms of producing low-end products, but they have significant cost advantages, and there is not a huge loss to transitioning to supply chains that run through those countries rather than through China. There's more of like I said, a kind of a transition cost while specific products are being developed for manufacturing in those places, but they're not under a significant cost advantage relative to China. So that's number one. Number two, the dreams of striking it rich in the Chinese market are dead. Okay, so in one area after another, China has either kept out foreign companies from achieving dominant roles. An example of that would be in the whole area of the internet platform economy. Basically, Western companies were just kept out. In other areas, they have been invited in, but then, just as I mentioned, their technology was stolen, their Chinese competitors were subsidized, and they are being rapidly replaced by Chinese companies. The latest example of that we can see is the automotive industry. Okay, so for a long time, especially Japanese and European companies sold cars on a huge scale in China. I should also mention South Korean companies. They are being pushed out very rapidly. They have very little future in the Chinese market. So both of the ways in which we were expected to gain economic advantage from integrating with China are disappearing rapidly, I would say, or fading rapidly is maybe more accurate. And for the reasons that we talked about, it has become dangerous now in areas of high technology or even areas outside of high technology that are strategically important, such as the area of rare earth minerals. That's another example. It is dangerous to become dependent on China because China will just use that dependence for economic, political, military advantage at a time of its own choosing.
So should we just be, excuse me, should we just avoid, can't we just avoid them? Why don't we just stop buying their stuff and stop selling them anything and just deal with other countries?
Well, I think that is happening. There has been a major change, I would say, especially since the first Trump administration. And I don't want to limit it to Trump. This is the area, I would say, of greatest foreign policy consensus in the United States. And it's also something that you see now in places like Japan or South Korea or Taiwan or the European Union or England. That is, these not just governments, but the business organizations and big businesses that have operations in China, whether those are supply chains or whether those are export markets, they are not able to export successfully to China in the way they expect it to be. And they are seeing their own foreign and domestic markets threatened by this unfair Chinese competition. But it's too painful to go cold turkey. The level of interdependence was so great that it's too costly to suddenly cut off China. It has to be a gradual process, and that process is occurring. And you see that in economic policy making in all of these countries.
So we have one more question in the Google Doc, and then we'll invite Alexander to ask his question. Cults of personality and state control of an economy both have their own weaknesses, along with those strengths that you've discussed. Strong men can be flattered at the expense of capacity to rule, and communism in the USSR at least produced ultimately disappointing economic and industrial results. Are there any signs of similar weaknesses here?
So I would say the answer to that is yes. There are signs of such weakness, but for the reason that Alexander mentioned, that China has a market economy and it is a very dynamic market economy despite all the errors of state policymaking. So there are significant errors that Xi Jinping is committing economically, mainly by accentuating the previous bias toward financing and privileging state-owned enterprises and already existing large private enterprises that have close connections with the Chinese party state, and trying to pick winners on a huge scale that is pouring huge resources into things like AI or semiconductors in a way which is very wasteful. So that is slowing down China's growth. But the problem is that because of China's already great wealth and the residual dynamism of its private sector, it is still growing, modernizing, and it is throwing off huge revenues for the party to spend however it wants. So there's no question that Xi is harming China's interests. In other words, there was no reason to do all of this stuff to prematurely confront the United States and its allies. Deng's policy was correct. China simply had to sit back, grow, and wait for the fruit to ripen. China's economy would have grown more rapidly. It would have entered in a decentralized way all sorts of high technology industries, and it would have become more and more powerful in every dimension of national power. So Xi has weakened China not only by intervening heavily in the economy, but by antagonizing all of China's potential enemies at one time, which is also damaging in a strategic way, as we talked about, not just economically, but it still represents a very formidable challenge. And again, I would say more formidable than the old Soviet Union because of that dynamic market economy.
Thank you, Shale. And then we have Alexander, maybe for our last question.
Okay, you can hear me, right? You can hear me. Yeah. So just a couple of quick things. So one is on China and the global South. So I saw an interview with David P. Goldman, who writes a lot about China. You may know him, and he was saying that part of China's plans to deal with, let's say, the demography problem that you had touched on earlier is essentially to integrate the global South into the Chinese economy. So you see China very active in Africa, in the Islamic world, in parts of Latin America, and so forth, many of which have populations which are highly fertile, right? I mean, which have a lot of children. And he was arguing that they're basically not only taking control of critical resources that could help also their defense industry, but also sort of converting these economies into sort of adjuncts of the Chinese economy. That was sort of his argument. So I was curious what you thought of that. And the other thing is the United States, well, let's say that there are lots of foreign policy debates. And one of the things it seems the MAGA movement is very interested is knowing like what the stakes are. And I certainly think that there are high stakes if, let's say, China were able to dominate Asia. I think the stakes for the United States would be enormous, but I'm wondering if you could articulate those, because that's going to be important in the, what may well be the global struggle of the 21st century. So those are my two questions: China and the global South, and what it's doing there, and the second is the stakes of if China succeeds in dominating its own region.
Yeah, so thank you for those questions. So I guess I have two answers to the question about the global South. The first one is this is definitely an area where China can be more successful in establishing strong influence than is the case with in what you might call like the US-led bloc or coalition, which includes the advanced economies in particular that we were talking about before. So why? The reason is that the leaders of the global South, they don't have conflicts with China, generally speaking. So they don't have military conflicts with China. They're already much lower down in the value chain economically than China. So they're expecting to continue to import high technology goods from other countries. They're not focused on entering those markets themselves. And also, they are, politically myopic, generally speaking. They're looking for short-term advantage. And China is coming in and offering all kinds of advantages. I mean, one is, like the Belt and Road type infrastructure loans to build infrastructure in these countries. So while these loans are potentially damaging to these countries in the sense that these are not commercially viable projects, generally speaking, so the Chinese are pouring in this money and they're expecting it to be repaid, which it can't be based upon the rate of return of these infrastructure projects. So it creates a debt problem for these countries. And according to the latest statistics that I saw referred to, China has recently become a net capital importer from the global South because it has stopped engaging in large-scale Belt and Road investments, and it is starting to receive large-scale repayments. The other area in which it can easily move into these economies, the last point I wanted to make about that is that the current leaders in these countries are myopic, mostly in the sense that they don't care if there's a bigger debt problem in 10 or 20 years. That money gives them a big advantage now to staying in power. So that they're likely to take those loans. Another example would be subsidized Chinese products in areas that potentially are dangerous for advanced economies, like, let's say, telecommunications. So, for example, does Ethiopia care if Huawei builds its telecommunication system? If they're willing to build that system at a relatively low price and they can use it for their own purposes, and they don't think that China is going to stab them in the back, then why not let China build those networks? Why not let Chinese companies establish strong roles in Africa, or you can fill in the blank, Latin America, and so on. So the countries that are more resistant to this are countries like India, which have a conflict potentially with China. So they don't want any of this because they view it as dangerous to themselves. And in fact, India has gone further than the United States in pushing China out. So China is achieving this influence in the global South. There isn't a lot that we can do about that because we're not willing to provide. When I say we, I don't just mean the United States, I mean the whole coalition. We're not willing to provide these kind of cut rate loans, which aren't as productive, or subsidized goods. So we're not going to compete with China in those ways. The other point, though, is that China can't really use those populations, like, let's say, of Africa, where the fastest growing populations are. Those are just markets, right? I mean, those are not available for Chinese war production or recruitment of troops, right? I mean, the Chinese aren't interested in foreigners coming to China. That's not going to happen. They're not going to be bringing in like 50 million people from Africa to live in China. So in that sense, it's not an answer to the demographic problem. In terms of the stakes for the US, one can imagine a world where the US withdraws from its traditional commitments, withdraws to Fortress America, so to speak, right? So that means it withdraws its military commitments to places not only like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, but to Australia, to Western Europe. Those would be the most extreme examples. So what would happen if the United States did that? Okay, so first of all, those regions would, so to speak, go it alone in a variety of ways. They would, in the way that was most feasible for them, they would pursue their own kind of carrot and stick policy toward China. They would develop their own deterrence capabilities to the best of their ability. And at the same time, they would try and appease China insofar as it did not undermine their ability to protect their vital national interests. China, as a result of that, would probably become much more powerful than it is now because it would no longer be facing a kind of unified or semi-unified opposition from all of these places. It would be able to deal with all of them separately. And maybe the United States would be able to avoid direct warfare with China in that way. I say maybe because that's dependent on how China's foreign policy develops once it achieves, dominance throughout its own region and in other parts of the world. Would the United States really be able to retreat completely into an isolated position, not just militarily, but economically, allow itself to become, dependent and vulnerable to China in those ways? It seems wiser to me to take advantage of the existing strengths that the United States has now in its system of, alliances, which encompass both economic integration and military cooperation. In other words, better to fight if you need to from a more advantageous position than retreat to a position of greater weakness where you hope that you won't need to become involved in a conflict.
Thank you, Shale. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to now turn it over to Gabriel, who will thank us for coming.
Yeah, I'll just thank you all for coming, and thank Shale for really sharing incredible expertise in this area and all the complex variety of considerations that go into this. Really, I really appreciate it, and I hope we'll hear more from you about this. And thank you all for coming. We'll see you at the next meeting in 3 weeks. All the best.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. Thanks a
Thank
lot,
you.
Shale.
Bye,
Take
everyone.
care.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.